This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Brady Brewer, K-State Associate Professor in Agricultural Economics, to talk about long-term strategic risk in operations and what can help prepare managers to withstand unplanned concerns. K-State's Ashlee Westerhold and Reid keep the show rolling as they converse about the upcoming Kansas Landowner Conference. They preview the topics that will be discussed and how this year's program differs. Ending the show is K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini as she discusses the science behind composting and how to start your own compost pile. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about risk in operations with Associate Professor in K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, Brady Brewer. Brady, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Shelby.
And Brady, real quick before we hop into talking about the different risk in operations, welcome back to K-State. Can you tell us a little bit about your history and what you're here at K-State to do?
Yeah, so as what Shelby's alluding to, we are recording this on my second day of employment for Kansas State, but I'm not a newbie to Kansas State. I got my master's and PhD here from 2010 to 2015, and I've since been at some other universities and recently took the opportunity to come back, or, I would like to say come back home to Kansas State.
So talking about the risks now, as you've made your way back to K-State, first wanting to mention the different type of risks that we might talk about a little bit about today.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about strategic risk, and this work comes from some colleagues that I had at a previous institution at Purdue University, and I worked a lot there with agribusinesses in the ag supply chain, and agribusinesses tend to think a little bit more about this concept of strategic risk. So in agriculture, and when I say agriculture, I mean farms, tend to think a lot about operational risks, i.e. weather or price risk. That's something we talk a lot about for extension audiences and how to manage that for a farm, but we don't talk a lot about this other type of risk that we call strategic risk, which is this more long-term risk that businesses of any type face that comes from these exogenous market shocks that'll change the market that we play in.
Brady, what are some examples of strategic risk?
So operational risk I already mentioned is going to be like your weather and your price, but strategic risk, some examples are going to be changes in government policy that shift the market, or maybe geopolitical conflict. We've seen that currently with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, how it's actually changed where we ship grain throughout the world. Maybe disease risk changes what we can actually grow in an area of the country, maybe changes to consumer preferences, or maybe technological uncertainties. Maybe there's a change in what a certain manufacturer can supply to the market, or a new technological advancement that changes entirely how we produce something.
Is this something then that farmers and ranchers need to take the time to sit down and think about the different what-if scenarios for this?
Yes. So these what-if scenarios that you mentioned, there are 1,000 different what-if scenarios when we're talking about strategic risk, which makes it a really hard concept to wrap your head around, because there isn't just one thing that we can say, okay, do this to mitigate this risk. There's these what-if scenarios. What if my supplier of seed for the crops that I grow is unable to supply me with inputs for the next growing season? What if where I take my grain I produce on my farm can no longer take it, is shut down, and I have to find new markets for what I produce on my farm? What if the supplier of equipment that I typically use on my farm goes out of business? How am I going to get equipment for the next year? These are all kind of these what-if scenarios we need to be thinking about. And yes, there's 1,000 different ones. You can't think through all the what-if scenarios that could happen to your farm, but just having a plan in place and knowing maybe what direction you would head off to if one of these things were to happen, just gets your farm on the right footing and can get you out in front of what may happen.
Is this a time when maybe core values of what's important to your farm is also important to recognize and know what they are?
Yeah, this is where, as I said, I always work with, or have worked with, agribusinesses in the supply chain. And I think farms should probably adopt some of those business practices. So having core values, planting your flag in the sand somewhere down the road of where you think you're wanting to go as an operation, whether that means growth or what size you want to be or what products you want to grow. So that way, when these shocks happen, when these events happen, yes, they may push you off course, but you can steer back in at least the general direction of where you're wanting to go. And there's really two main reasons for why you should think through all these what-if scenarios, and that's agility and absorption capacity. So agility is this concept that a farm's ability to quickly identify and capture business opportunities as these events arise can be changed through the planning process. And then absorption capacity is a farm's ability to withstand these shocks from strategic risk. And what we find is that, just planning for these what-if scenarios helps both of these concepts, helps you be more agile to actually capture upside that may arise from some of these events, but also weather the downside risk from these shocks.
And what are some different factors that farmers should evaluate maybe when they're thinking through all these different what-if scenarios?
So in general, I have a framework that I call the 5 managerial levers that we can think about how to actually categorize the strategic risks and what you can actually do to prepare for them on your farm. So the first managerial lever would be managing the output price you get for your product. The second would be managing the yield or how much you produce on your farm. The third would be managing the costs or how much it costs you to produce your output. The fourth would be managing the assets or what assets it takes to produce that output. And then the fifth managerial lever is managing the people aspect of the farm. Broadly speaking, any decision a business owner makes or a farm manager makes falls into one of these 5 broad categories.
As we're thinking about farming operations, managing risk, is there a place where you saw maybe farmers should spend a little bit more time?
My colleagues at Purdue University did a survey of farms across the nation, and they looked at and asked farms, do you evaluate your cropping practices, right? And what they found was about 40% of farmers say, no, I don't go back and evaluate what I've done in the past. And this is that asking those what-if scenarios, right? What happens if this shock to the price environment were to happen in the long term? They also asked them, do you think you have a strong balance sheet, right? This goes back to that concept of absorption capacity and weathering that downside risk.
Is there a managerial lever that you think maybe farmers should spend a little bit more time in, or does it vary?
So of these 5 managerial levers, which one a farm should spend the most time on is really going to be dependent on the core values that farm sets, which is why it's so important to set the strategy of the farm and those core values. Across farms, based on the survey data that we have looked at, different farms spend a different amount of emphasis or put a different amount of emphasis on these 5 managerial levers. For instance, there are some farms that what I would say try to save themselves to prosperity, right? They really focus on managing that cost lever. There's other farms that try to yield themselves to prosperity, right? And they really focus on managing how much they produce with the inputs that they put into their production system. Neither is correct. It's going to be dependent on your soil type, where you are, in your managerial strategy. So that's really going to guide which managerial lever the farmer needs to spend most of their time on, which is going to be based on those core principles and strategy you set forth for your farm.
And Brady, a lot of times everything has a life cycle or cycle it goes through. And something you talked about in a presentation recently when you talked about risk and operations, the life cycle of the farm versus the farmer's life cycle.
Yes, and these are two very different things. And when we're talking about strategic risks, since these tend to be very long-term risk or long-term shifts in the market, it really matters here because the life cycle of the business is going to be different from the life cycle of the farmer. This is why we have transition planning, and hopefully if it's done correctly, the life cycle of the business is going to be longer than the life cycle of the owner of that particular business, or in this case, a farm. So we got to plan and set strategy for the farm. And when we're thinking about these strategic risks based on the life cycle of the business, not necessarily the life cycle of the business owner, because that could have different implications for how we allocate assets or maybe pull those 5 managerial levers on the farm.
Brady, for long-term strategic risks, what are some key takeaways you'd really like to share with farmers and ranchers?
Well, so first is have a plan. Ask those what-if scenarios. Because that's going to define how you react when these events happen. So for instance, if a market goes away where you typically take product. I know I've already given that as an example. Just knowing, hey, here's who I'm going to call and here's my backup plan just makes when stuff does go south that much more smooth and gets you back on your feet. So first, have a plan. Ask those what-if scenarios. Second, understand your strategy as a farm. As I said, there's 1,000 what-if scenarios that we can't really think through. It's just impossible to predict some of the events that's going to happen in the world that are going to impact our markets. But understanding your strategy, if you are a farmer that's going to save your way to prosperity, that really focuses on pulling that managerial cost lever, that may dictate how you respond to some of these events. And really point to what would be, if you have several options, may help you decide what would be the best option to take for your farm.
Brady, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much.
That was Associate Professor in K-State's Agricultural Economics Department, Brady Brewer. We're now going to be joined by Director of Communications and Outreach for Kansas Grain Sorghum, Maddie Meyer, as she reminds us about Sorghum Connection and its upcoming field days. Maddie, what is Sorghum Connection?
So Sorghum Connection is all about maximizing sorghum yield. This program will consist of field schools and winter meetings located across Kansas. Sorghum Connection is a collaborative effort between the K-State Department of Plant Pathology, K-State Research and Extension, and the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission, aiming to bring multidisciplinary, data-driven information to our Kansas grain sorghum producers to help improve on-farm productivity and profitability. Field schools will be held on Bavaria, Kansas on September 4th, Dighton, Kansas on September 11th, and September 18th in Russell, Kansas.
Where would people be able to figure out where to register for these events?
To register and to stay tuned for more information, visit www.ksgrainsorghum.org.
We're now cutting to a short break, but we'll be right back.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we continue today's show by talking about the upcoming Kansas Landowner Conference with Ashlee Westerhold, Director of the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition at K-State, and Robin Reid, K-State Extension Farm Economist. Ashlee, Robin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
To begin our discussion, Robin, what is the Kansas Landowner Conference?
So we started this conference last year, and it's really an initiative to reach landowners across our state. I've done a couple different research projects at just seeing who our landowners are and how land has transitioned throughout recent years. And really what I found in my research is really no surprise, but we're having more and more landowners that are less connected to the land than they used to be as we have fewer, larger farms across the state. And we have a baby boomer generation of farmers that are retiring and not necessarily selling their ground, but that might transition to the next generation who's not actively farming, but are in the landowner capacity. So really, we started this conference to help landowners across our state just learn about agriculture, learn about lease agreements, learn about how to manage their ground as a landowner and work with a farm tenant.
Robin, how is this year's conference different than last year's?
So last year was our inaugural conference. We had really good turnout, really great feedback, and it was all in one day. We expanded this year's conference to actually a 2-day conference and have a number of breakout sessions where landowners can choose what topics they want to go to.
Ashlee, when is this event taking place?
So the Kansas Landowner Conference will be on October 10th and 11th this year, and that conference will be at the Kansas State Alumni Center, and so we are very excited. We know that this is smack dab, maybe in the middle of harvest for some people. However, again, we are trying to hit the people who own Kansas land but are not operating Kansas land. So we are excited to have them on Kansas State campus, again, October 10th and 11th.
Who should think about attending this event, Ashlee?
Our target audience for this conference are those who are going to be more of the landowner who do not live and operate their parcel. And so this landowner could be someone who has been a current operator who's now transitioning into a retired role where they are just interested in being a landowner and how to handle that. Additionally, another audience that we are really targeting are those who did not necessarily grow up on the farm, or those who inherited a farm but do not know where to start on how to handle being a landowner. So we are really trying to target the audience that have ties to the farm, have ownership of a farm, could potentially have ownership, but would not know how to necessarily be that landowner or understand the management practices that go within owning farm ground or ranch land or pasture land.
Robin, why is it important for landowners to attend this event?
The number one question that we get as an Ag Econ department, as our 105 county offices across the state, deals with leasing questions. And a lot of times that is, what is the going rate for farm ground or pasture rental in my area? Or what are the legal implications? What should I have in a written lease? If I don't have a written lease, what are the Kansas statutes that I have to abide by? And so really this conference brings together all of our resources at K-State. And I think one of the eye-opening experiences last year that I saw from a lot of our attendees was just, I didn't know this information existed or these resources, and just how appreciative our attendees were last year, knowing all this different information and people to contact when they had questions on their leasing agreement or even how to do a leasing agreement.
Robin, multiple breakout sessions are held during the conference. What can participants expect to learn in them?
These all came from requests that we had last year in just different topics that landowners wanted. We actually have 15 unique breakout session topics, so I won't go through them all, but some of them that I think will be very highly sought after would be wind and solar leases. You see more and more of those popping up across the state. Hunting leases, general comments on the farm economy and where that's going. One of the aspects of this conference is to just inform landowners on what's going on in agriculture. One thing we're seeing right now is some pretty tight times ahead for agriculture, especially in our grain commodities. So really informing landowners, as that is going to have some impact on our rental rates going forward if we have continued downturn in the farm economy. So we're going to talk about that in multiple breakout sessions. Some other ones, just some components of a good written lease, what it should include, carbon credits, how to navigate that market, easements, so conservation easements, that's a big thing in our state, talking to landowners about that, and then other conservation programs through the NRCS or Farm Service Agency that are available, just lease basics, crop insurance, grain marketing for those crop share landlords out there that do market their own grain, leasing rates, negotiating your farm lease. Again, there's just a wealth of different topics that we're going to have at this conference.
Other parts of this conference include our macroeconomic implications for Kansas landowners, Kansas land values and ownership trends, best practices in landowner-tenant communication, protecting the legacy of your land in Kansas, so not only as landowners or land operators, really talking about estate planning for all people who own land in Kansas. And then we actually will finish out this program, our Kansas Landowner Conference, with a panel of agricultural producers to talk about what they are seeing on the farm as tenants. And so our conference really has the main sessions, and then we also have those breakout sessions that Robin was able to talk about.
What are some of the general sessions in this year's conference?
So the Kansas Landowner Conference general sessions that we encourage participants to sit through, as it is the general sessions, really are to hit home the idea of why it is so important to be a very aware landowner for Kansas land, why you should be a well-informed business manager of your land. Really, we're talking about things that are going to impact every farm in Kansas over the next couple of years. The best practices in landowner-tenant communication is going to be so important as we potentially hit a downturn in the farm economy. And so having open conversations with a tenant or landowner and how to start those conversations, be a part of it, will be a huge benefit from showing up to this conference and being willing to learn all of these aspects of land ownership that you might not be able to learn anywhere else.
Robin, are there going to be any vendors at the 2024 Kansas Landowner Conference?
Yeah, so one of the unique aspects, too, of this conference is the amount of vendors that we had. And a lot of these are professional farm management companies, or as you can imagine, real estate agents. And they are very unique, too, in the amount of services that they can offer here in Kansas. And just having them all together in one area where you can talk to multiple companies if you're interested in a professional farm manager or talking to a real estate agent. That way, by attending the conference, you're able to see what the resources that are out there here in Kansas that might be able to help you with some of those type of questions.
Ashlee, what is the cost for registration?
We have an early bird cost right now, and that would be $375 per person or $650 for 2 business partners. We are excited because we are offering a business partner discount rate this year. So we know a lot of couples or siblings that are business partners. And so having both people there to experience a conference is something that we want to encourage. And that could also be 2 generational. So we are excited to have that business partner discount. These prices are promotional before September 15th. So this is our discounted early bird rate, and those prices do go up after September 15th.
I will add to that, too, a question we get a lot is there a virtual option for this conference? And we are not offering that because we really think the experience in person cannot be replicated online. So even though, we do hope that landowners travel from out of state to here in Kansas, we really want them to experience this conference in person.
Ashlee, also wanting to mention some of the hotel and lodging details.
All of the information that you would need to find out about this conference is on AgManager.info/landowner. And so if you are interested in wondering where the hotel is or the information regarding hotel, parking, directions, flight schedules, all of that could be found on our AgManager.info/landowner. And so as a conference registrant, you will have the opportunity to be a part of the block of rooms available at the Holiday Inn at the campus center, which is right across from the Alumni Center. And so it is an easy transition to go from your hotel room to the conference. And all of that information, again, can be found at AgManager.info/landowner.
Ashlee, Robin, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the director of the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition at K-State, Ashlee Westerhold, and K-State Extension farm economist Robin Reid, with details about the upcoming Kansas Landowner Conference held October 10th and 11th. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but stay tuned in because we'll be back with more up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Composting is a process that occurs naturally as organic materials break down in the landscape. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini says that it can also help your garden and your pocketbook. Cynthia, I know we like the fact that people do like to compost. It's a great way to get that organic matter. And there are really some do's and don'ts when it comes to this, but the thing that we need are greens and browns.
Exactly. And that's something you hear all the time. When you talk about composting, you are going to hear somebody say, make sure you have a good blend of greens and browns. So what does that mean? The greens are going to be things like fresh plant material that you've just pulled out of the ground, or kitchen waste like apple cores, banana peels, those kinds of things, as well as grass clippings if it hasn't been treated with any type of chemical. And then the browns are going to be those dried plant materials, organic mulch like wood chips, those kinds of things that are chopped real small, shredded dried leaves that you're raking up soon as we approach fall. Those types of dried plant material. And a mix of the greens and the browns is what's going to give you a good balance of nutrients, and it's going to give you the best decomposition rates.
And we really want to make sure that this is kind of a confined space. We don't want this to be too big.
Exactly. For the typical home gardener, you want your compost heap to be about 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. And that's for a couple of reasons. One of those being it's it's going to be easier for you to manage. If you create a mountain of compost, it's going to be really challenging for you to turn it unless you've got some kind of equipment to help you out. But it also helps the temperature, helps you get to the right temperature. If your pile is too small, it's not going to heat up as much as it needs to for that decomposition. But if it's too large of a pile, you can also have a struggle with getting enough oxygen into that pile. And oxygen is really important for decomposing.
And the layering is also important?
Right. When you're putting your pile together, layering greens, then browns, and then adding some water in with each layer also.
So what does the water do?
The water is going to help with the temperature, which is essential for decomposition. If your pile is dry, then it's not going to be heating up and it's not going to be decomposing as rapidly as you would like. And the problem with that is if you are expecting to have a compost pile that you can use next spring and it hasn't decomposed fully, you're actually going to be potentially introducing more problems into your garden than benefits. One of those being if you have composted any type of plant material that has diseases or that might be overwintering pests and it doesn't decompose fully, then you're just going to be adding that into your garden next year. Another issue is if your compost hasn't fully decomposed and you add it into your garden, it could potentially be using up some of those nutrients in your soil that you were hoping your plants would be getting.
One thing I know that they say to keep an eye on is tomato plants because sometimes there's disease in the plant.
Exactly. Tomato plants commonly are getting some of those diseases like early blight and septoria, and some of those can overwinter in the plant material. So if you compost your tomato plants, my first recommendation is don't compost them if you know they have disease. It can be a challenge to make sure that your compost pile gets hot enough to kill off those diseases. So if you already know you've had trouble with the diseases, just destroy that plant matter and don't try to compost it. But if you do compost it, really make sure that you have a fully decomposed pile before incorporating it into your garden next year.
Well, this is really great for the environment because it keeps things out of the landfill and then it comes back and helps you grow more produce.
Absolutely. It benefits your pocketbook because you're not having to purchase compost. On that note, if you are buying compost or bringing in compost from an outside source, you do want to be sure to understand how that compost was cared for. If the person that you're getting that compost from was treating the ingredients with some type of an herbicide, that's something that you're going to want to know because there could be residual amounts that are left in the compost, and that could affect next year's garden when you use it in your own soil.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist with information on starting a compost pile. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.